So let's talk about why and how to use ND filters with the DJI Osmo Pocket 3. Let's start off with the why of ND filters. The easiest way to explain why you need ND filters is to first explain the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is a term in videography and photography that explains the three core values that affect how your image or video looks. Those values are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And how you set those values greatly affects the appearance of your footage or your photo. So next, let's talk about what an ND filter is. ND stands for neutral density, and an ND filter basically is sunglasses for your camera. That ND filter filters out a certain amount of light depending on the value of the filter. And ultimately, filtering out that light allows you to set a slower shutter speed than you would otherwise be able to set. And for videography, the goal of an ND filter is to have your shutter speed fulfill that 180-degree shutter angle. The 180-degree shutter angle allows your footage to have that cinematic motion blur, and it helps your footage look extra good. So if you're filming in 24 frames per second, on the Osmo Pocket 3, you would want your shutter speed set to 1/50. If you're filming in 30 frames per second, you would want it set to 1/60. And if you're filming in 60 frames per second, you would want your shutter speed set to 1/120. This is how you have footage with the proper level of motion blur. If you don't have an ND filter and have the shutter speed on auto, oftentimes the shutter speed is going to be really fast, and every frame is going to be really sharp, including all the motion in the frame. Any motion in the footage is not going to feel quite right when viewing it. There's not going to be that blur. Right now, this camera I'm talking to has an ND filter on it, and when I move my hand, you can see that blur. But if I didn't have the ND filter on, my shutter speed would be pretty fast, and my hand, each frame, it would be very sharp. You wouldn't see the motion there. But with the ND filter on, any motion looks and feels really natural. And it's a lot more appealing to the human eye. So when you use an ND filter with your Osmo Pocket 3, you can have a static aperture value, which is already static, by the way. That aperture value is f2.0 on the Osmo Pocket 3, and the aperture cannot be changed. But the ISO and the shutter speed can both be changed. And I'm gonna talk about those settings you wanna aim for in a moment. But having that ND filter will allow you to set your ISO to a static value, and then you'll also be able to set your shutter speed to fulfill the 180-degree shutter angle. So now that we've talked about why and what ND filters are, let's get into the fun part and talk about how to use these. So first of all, the ND filters that I use is this mega limited edition pack right here from Freewell. And as you may guess by the name of this pack is mega. It's got 14 different filters in it, and these include ND filters, but there's also that mist filter in here, which is really great. And there's also a CPL and an LPR filter. So if you're wondering what those are, the CPL is basically a polarizing filter without the ND functionality. So if you wanted to keep your shutter speed set to auto, but you wanted to filter out some of that bright light to get clearer images, CPL filter would be a great choice. The LPR filter basically helps you filter out light pollution, and it's going to specifically help filter out light pollution from artificial lighting. So if you're in a place such as indoors where you don't want that bad look that artificial lighting sometimes gives, you would probably want to use the LPR filter. And the other really cool thing about these filters is these are stackable. So if you want to use an ND filter, but you also want the mist filter, you can stack them. The magnets are also really strong. So oftentimes when I'm using an ND filter, I also like to use that mist filter on top of it. So let's go through an illustration of how to use these filters. And specifically, what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you how to attach the filter, and I'm also going to show you how to set the values on your Osmo Pocket 3 to get the very best footage with these filters. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to power on the Osmo Pocket 3, and we're going to make sure we're in video mode. So let's talk about the settings that you want to key in on your Osmo Pocket 3, and then we're going to talk about how to know which ND filter to use. So first thing you want to do is you want to swipe up, and you want to select your resolution and frame rate. So if you're going to use 4K 24 like I am, do 4K 24. You of course can go all the way up to 4K 60 in this mode. So you just want to select your resolution and frame rate first. So I'm going to keep it right there at 4K 24. Next, we're going to swipe over from the right, and this is where we're going to change the values that really matter most for how to use ND filters. So up there under exposure, it currently says auto. This is where we're going to change those three values of the exposure triangle. So I'm going to click on exposure here, and I'm going to go down here to M, and M stands for manual. Now when I do that, you can see the values that I had keyed in previously. and you'll notice the screen goes almost completely white and blown out. And this is because I have the shutter speed set to 1/50, which is that twice the frame rate to fulfill the 180-degree shutter rule. And then I have the ISO over here currently set to 100. I'm gonna lower the ISO to 50. We wanna keep the ISO as low as possible. Now you see in a moment, I may have to fine tune it a little bit after we get the ND filter on. But for now, I'm going to click confirm. Swipe back here. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put an ND filter on. Now I want you to see what happens when I put that ND filter on. So the ND filter I'm gonna choose ND16 for now, and we're gonna see what that does to our image. So I'm gonna get ND16 here, and I'm gonna pop it on. And it's real easy to get on because it's magnetic. You just have to hold it close and it'll jump onto the camera. All right, so as you can see, adding that ND16 filter made a huge difference. It instantly took that blown out image and it made it look really good. So what we wanna do here is we wanna check and make sure ND16 is indeed the best option. So if you look really closely up here, you may or may not be able to see it, but there is a gray EV value. And basically, that's the exposure value. You ideally want to keep that value up there as close to 0 as possible and not any lower or higher than 0.3. If you had to err one side or the other, I would err on the side of negative 0.3 and have it slightly underexposed. So if we go back here now and click on exposure where it says M, you can look up here and it's gonna show you what the current exposure value is, because it can be sometimes hard to see on that other screen. So currently it's slightly underexposed, it's -1, but that's okay because we have a little bit of room to work here with our ISO values. So what I can do is I can bump the ISO up a little. So when I take it from 50 to 100, you'll see the EV up here goes to 0.0. So that's all we had to do in this case. Now, if I had put on the ND8, this still would have been too bright, even with it at ISO 50. So ND8 would not have been sunglasses enough for Osmo Pocket 3, but ND16 is just right. So we're gonna click confirm, and then we're gonna swipe this back. So that's how you check to know which ND filter is the proper one to use. Once you've got that all set up, you're good to start recording. Right now, the sun is getting pretty low in the sky because the sun's gonna set in about an hour. But if it's a really bright day, like noontime, the sun's right above you, and let's say you're at a beach or some type of bright setting, you're probably gonna wanna use ND32 or ND64 in order to properly expose your scene. So when it's time to take the filter off, I do recommend turning off the Osmo Pocket 3 first. So I'm gonna do that here. And it's going to automatically detect a filter still on there. And instead of tucking in, it's going to swivel around and be on the outside here. So when you're taking it off, I do recommend holding this firmly as you pull it off. Now, the reason I don't recommend switching it out when it's powered on is because you're gonna be working against the gimbal motors, and that could damage the gimbal. Now, if I had decided to use one of the polarizing filters, I wanna show you quick what that's like here. So to use the polarizing filter, there's this little line on there that adjusts the strength of the polarizing filter. You can actually rotate these. And in order to have the polarizer at the full strength, you wanna have those two lines match up right there. When those two white lines are lined up, that means the polarizing effect is also applied. If you don't want it applied, you can turn this line back to about 180 degrees from there, and that's going to turn off the polarizing filter, but still keep the ND applied. And I also want to show you the filter stacking functionality here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put the ND16 filter on first. So we're gonna put that right here. So the ND16 filter is on. Next, I'm gonna add this mist filter right here. So all we have to do is hold it close. Look at that. It's gonna lock right on, and we're gonna have two filters that are stacked there, ready to use. Being able to stack filters like this adds a lot of value to this freewall set, and it helps you capture some really good cinematic looking footage. And of course, the filters in here are not just for videography. You can also use a filter in here to get really good long exposure photos. Waterfalls are my favorite way to use this. This right here is a classic place where you'll want to use the ND1000 filter to get a long exposure photo. Let me demonstrate. So for capturing a long exposure photo, you want to make sure you're in photo mode. Once you're in photo mode, you want to swipe up, and you can set the aspect ratio at the top. You can do 16:9 or 1:1. I often like to do 1:1 because it utilizes the full sensor. And then for the countdown, I recommend setting it to 3 seconds. That way it gives you time to hit the record button here and then step back. And it helps stop any wobble going on with your camera before it takes the photo. And that's really important because you want the camera to be fully stationary. That way it's not capturing any movement of the camera. You want to capture any movement in your scene. Once you've done that, you want to swipe over and you want to make sure your format is set to JPEG plus RAW. That RAW photo is going to give you the most flexibility to edit with later on. White balance, you can keep that at auto white balance, that's fine. You can always adjust it when editing. Then for exposure, you want to make sure your value is changed to 1 second there. Then you want your ISO as low as possible. I recommend setting it to 50. And then finally, you want to make sure you put on your ND1000 filter before you take your photo. And we're going to pop that on the front. When we do, you can see that quickly takes the exposure value from plus 2.7 all the way down to negative 1.3. This is where we want to do a little bit of a shift with the ISO. And in this case, we want to go to ISO 100. ISO 100 is the closest we can get to an EV value of 0 without overexposing. At ISO 100, our EV value is negative 0.3, which is perfect for a photo. If we go to ISO 200, it takes the EV value to plus 0.7, and that is too high. We're going to lose detail in our highlights if we do that. So ISO 100 is exactly what we want in this situation. Then we're going to click confirm. So if you want to get the very best footage possible from the Osmo Pocket 3, I highly recommend picking up a set of the ND filters and pairing them with your Pocket 3. Doing so helps you get that nice cinematic motion blur, and then pairing that ND filter with the mist filter helps make your footage look even more cinematic and incredible. Speaking of cinematic footage, if you want to learn how to grade D-Log M footage from the Osmo Pocket 3, check out this video right here.